Land is the basis of all independence.
Alright, this is Dr. V's Revolution Will Not Be Pesticides, and we're doing a video today about the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, also known as slavevoyages.org. Now, this video is really about, it's for people of African descent that would like to know have an idea of what their African ancestry might be, but are very skeptical about getting the DNA test. So, just to give you a little background about this database, I first learned about this when I was in graduate school. I was studying African history at Howard University under Jeannie Tongara, and one of the projects was to go navigate the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, or slavevoyages.org, and write a paper. Go through the database, look at the shipping records, look at the ports in which parts of Africa the Africans came from, look at where they were shipped to, look at some of the political strife that was going on in certain parts of Africa where these Africans were being sold from, etc., etc. And so it was actually at first, when you first start doing a project that you're unfamiliar with, it's obviously very difficult to do. But then after a while, you start to have fun with it. And I had a lot of fun with it, because when I wrote my master's thesis, I based it all around the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. My thesis was entitled "The African Origins of the Peoples of Grenada." I think it was 1709 to 1837 or something like that. And I just went in, looked at a lot of secondary sources, and then looked at the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database to explain some of the spikes and paucities in Africans being sold into slavery in Grenada, and what parts of Africa they came from in different periods, and what wars and conflicts and political issues may have caused these Africans to get sold into slavery at these times. Because, for those of you that don't know, my mom is from Grenada, and my dad is from Jamaica. So, just to even go back a little further, just to give you a little background information about all this, I started getting really into learning history, my African background, for a number of reasons. For one, it was always a curiosity just to kind of know where I came from. I remember when I was little, I saw the movie Roots, and I saw the movie Roots in passing when I was a little kid. Never really paid attention too much when I was a little kid, but when we saw it in 8th grade, I was glued. But we never actually got to finish the movie. So then in the summer after 8th grade and into 9th grade, I ended up, I got my mom to rent the movie for us from Blockbuster Videos. And I remember I watched that movie front and back religiously for months. So fascinated with the story. And I just thought it was so interesting how people can come from such a faraway, exotic place like Africa and just be transplanted into the Americas like that. That was the mentality that I had at the time. So I ended up renting it all the time and wanting to know more. And I thought it was so fascinating that Alex Haley was able to learn his African roots. He was able to trace back his family to the village of Jufere along the Gambia River, and that he was a Mandinka, right? So that was always really fascinating to me in itself. So when I got a little bit older and I went to community college, and I went to Florida State, and my major was political science and my minor was history when I was at Florida State. I was very interested. All the papers that I would write for my history classes would always have to do with Africa, because I always wanted to kind of dig deeper into having knowledge of the African continent. I also started listening to Malcolm X more, and by listening to Malcolm X, one of his main points that he always made a lot in a lot of his speeches was that people of African descent need to identify with Africa. We need to know where we come from. We need to know our languages. We need to know our name. We need to know what our culture was before the people of African descent in the Americas had been thoroughly brainwashed.
African Americans, or so-called Negro. One of the reasons that it is bad for us to continue to just refer to ourselves as so-called Negro, that's negative. When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
So that was a message that I always took to heart. So when I finished high school, when I finished my bachelor's at Florida State University, that was the same time where I went to Grenada in 2007. Now, when I was in Grenada in 2007, I had all the questions in the world, but I remember particularly I went to I went to, it wasn't a funeral, but there's this thing called the Big Drum Ceremony in Karakoo, which is an island off Grenada. And that's where my grandfather comes from. My grandfather had died in September of 2004. But it's a tradition in the island of Karakoo that 3 years after somebody passes away, you do a Socalled, or a big drum ceremony. And this is a tradition that I found out later has African origins. Because the Africans believe that when somebody dies, funerals are usually rushed, and you don't get to send people off in the proper way with a traditional funeral. So the Africans will wait some time after they bury somebody in the ground. They wait some time to lay down the tombstone and have a proper send-off of this African ancestor, or this black ancestor. In this case, it was my grandfather. So I didn't get to go to the actual funeral of my grandfather in September 2004 in Grenada, but I got to go to the Socalled 3 years later. And this is when a lot of people all over the world got to come to the Socalled. So when I was at this Socalled in Karakoo, now for those of you that don't know, Karakoo is a tiny little island off the coast of Grenada. It's one of the satellite islands. One of the Grenadines, just north of Grenada. And being on that island during this traditional ceremony, I noticed it was very, very African. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I remember the whole village came together and they started cooking food and everything in these huge pots. And it was stuff that I had seen on the Discovery Channel about Africa, you know. And so I was just fascinated about the whole thing. And then I remember in the evening, there was a bunch of food on the table. And I remember I wanted to go and grab some of this food. And then I was told I couldn't eat it. And I'm like, why not? And people were telling me that was for my grandfather. And I said, well, wait a second. My grandfather has been deceased for 3 years. How's he going to eat this food? But they said it's for the spirit of your grandfather. And I said, okay. And I started to realize it's a very spiritual essence of these people in Karakoo, which is what I read a lot about with the people from Africa. And started to make all these connections. Not only that, but I also had family members at this ceremony telling us that our ancestors come from Ghana. I said, our ancestors come from Ghana? What do you mean our ancestors come from Ghana? So this is why I start to question the validity of what they're saying. Because first of all, I'm like, when Kunta Kinte passed down his ancestral lineage and explained who he was to Alex Haley, Kunta Kinte didn't say he came from Gambia. He said he came from the village of Jufre that was near the river Gambia. But Gambia as a country wasn't a country in the 1750s when Kunta Kinte was born, in the 1760s when Kunta Kinte ended up in Annapolis, Maryland. So Ghana is a modern state. It's a modern nation state, created in 1957 out of the Gold Coast when that country got its independence, with their first president being Kwame Nkrumah. So I was like, how is it that you guys know, like, if our ancestors were to pass that, if our first ancestor were to come from the 1700s or whatever and pass down the knowledge of our origin through generation after generation, that ancestor would have not have mentioned anything about Ghana, unless they're talking about ancient Ghana. But ancient Ghana hadn't been in existence for about, the past, since like the 12 or 1300s. So what is this? And the ancient Ghana is not in the same place as the west coast of of the Gold Coast that they were talking about, that I know they were talking about. So I was like, how do you guys know this? But then I remember we had this, my grandfather, before he passed, he wrote down the names of his ancestors. And one of the things that he wrote down was his grandmother's name, who would be my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Teresa Kojo. Teresa Kojo. And when I was younger, I've seen this paper since I was for about 3 years. I never really noticed anything about it until I started looking into African history. So I made the connection. I remember when I was in Grenada, I made the connection because I realized Kojo, after doing all the research that I'd been doing in college, I didn't really make the connection before because I wasn't so inquisitive when I had first gotten that paper from my grandfather right before he died with the names of his forefathers and ancestors. But while I was at this Saracow, that's when I first dawned on me, Kojo. That's an Akan day name for boys born on Monday. But that was, and for those of you who don't know, the Akan people, those are the tree-speaking people of the Gold Coast who live in present-day Ghana. There's a number of nations that are tree-speaking. You have the Ashanti, you have the Fanti, you have the Wassa, you have the Akwamu, you have the Denchia. There's a number of different groups that live in that area that are tree-speaking that use the Akan day naming system. And Akan just basically means the general group that speaks tree. So I don't know specifically which one of those nations I would have been, but it's the general Akan. So my great-great-grandmother retained that cultural aspect, that Africanism, not as a first name, but as a last name. And as I started to look into it, I realized there were a lot of people in Karakoo who retain an Akan day name as their last name. You have Kojos, you have Kwashis, and you have other groups. You have other names like that. So I just thought it was very fascinating. But to corroborate this information, years later when I went to Howard University, and I had already pretty much suspected that, okay, I took this information, I ran with it. Okay, I'm a con. But then I went to Howard University and I started getting familiar with the Transatlantic Slave Trade database. I looked into the database, and I wanted to see if the ships matched up with the story that my family was saying. So I learned, so this is what I did. Went to the Transatlantic Slave Trade database, right? Slave voyages. I go here where it says Transatlantic. I click that, and go here where it says database. You Click the database. Now it gives you a bunch of random ships. This first page here looks like it's mostly, it's actually pretty random. It used to be, the first page used to just be a lot of Brazil. Alright. So if I want to find out which Africans landed in which ports throughout the Americas, I'm going to go to where it says itinerary. And scroll down to where it says place of purchase. And I'm going to come over and put principal place of slave purchase. And in there I am going to put Africa, meaning general Africa. Because if I want to know which parts of Africa, general Africa, people that landed in St. George's, Grenada came from, then I have to put general Africa. Okay? I'm not going to put a specific region or anything like that. Now there's an option to do that as well. And I'm going to click apply. Then I'm going to go back to itinerary, and then I'm going to put principal place of slave landing, or place of slave landing, principal place, and I'm going to type in the port in which I want to know about, and that's Grenada. All right, Grenada doesn't have any specific ports. Just is some of the larger countries or islands have specific ports. You can do that as well. Grenada is just Grenada. Click Grenada. I'm going to go where it says apply. So now I have all the ships that had ever landed in Grenada. But I don't want to just have random ships listed, right? So I'm going to go to where it says tables. Click tables, and it gives me the ships that landed in Grenada in 25-year increments. It says 140,265 is the total. But I want to know about the regions. I want it broken down into regions because I studied secondary sources, and Africa is broken down into 8 transatlantic slave trade regions. Senegambia, Sierra Leone, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Bida Benin, Bida Biafra, West Central Africa, and Southeast Africa. Okay, so those are the regions. When you come to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, you're going to find those same exact regions that I just explained. A lot of historians refer to them in their books, in their articles, and you're going to see it's a pretty uniform way of understanding Africa broken down into zones. And these zones are somewhat cultural. They have a lot to do. The zones have a lot to do with just certain pieces of natural barriers, land masses separating where the ports were. But for the most part, you can kind of have an idea of cultural continuities coming from the different regions, landing in certain areas. But I'm also going to explain some of the issues and problems that historians have debated about tracing ancestry by using the database. I'm going to explain that after I go through all this. So we got this, right? So tables. Now, instead of doing broad regions of disembarkation meaning where the slaves or the captives had landed, I'm going to go to broad or regions or embarkation regions right here, embarkation regions. And that will give me the 8 zones. So here it is, just as I explained. You got the Senegambia, you got the Sierra Leone, you got the Windward Coast, you got the Gold Coast, you got the Bida Benin, you got the Bida Biafra, and you got West Central Africa. And if you scroll a little bit down to the right, you have other. Other basically means these ships weren't documented. They'd been discovered as to landing in Grenada, but there's not a specified part of Africa in which they came from. All right. So whenever I try to get an idea of which regional group comprised of the ethnic majority in certain parts of the Americas, I exclude the other because the other can fall into any category. So, if you look here, which African ethnic group was the most numerous to be transported into Grenada. Our winner is the Bight of Biafra with 43,829 Africans. All right, now the Bight of Biafra is what you consider southeast Nigeria or even a little bit of North Cameroon. Okay, now most of the Africans that were passing through these ports in the Bight of Biafra, a lot of secondary sources, historians will say it's the Igbo people, especially passing through Bonny, Calabar, and New Calabar. So there's a large Igbo ethnic presence in the island of Grenada. But then if you look at the second most numerous, what do you see? 22,761. Where are they from? The Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is Ghana, or the Akan people, the Ashanti, the Fanti, the Akwamu, the Wasa, the Denchia. That's that group. So this kind of falls in line with some of what my family was saying. The 43,829, I looked this up before. This percentage is 36% of all Africans transported into Grenada between the years of the transatlantic slave trade came from the Bight of Biafra. That's 36%. But 19%, the 22,761, 19% came from the Gold Coast. That's a large number, considering all the different regions that there are and all the ways that they could be divided. 19% is pretty significant. 36% is very significant. Some places like Dominica have I think about 60% of all Africans come from the Bight of Biafra, which is huge. That means that's like a strictly Igbo culture coming out of Dominica there. So anyways, this made me feel, I took this information and I was like, wow, fascinating. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to run with it. So yeah, I took this information and I ran with it. Gold Coast, Akan, cool. That's what I'm working with. And I also discovered, looking at the Transatlantic Slave Trade database and secondary sources, that even Jamaica, my other half, my dad's side of the family, those Africans there, many of them also came from the Bight of Biafra and the Gold Coast. There's probably a larger percentage of Gold Coast Africans in Jamaica than there are in Grenada, but still significant numbers. All right. Now, what are the issues with the Transatlantic Slave Trade database? Well, there's a historian by the name of Judith Carney. There's another historian by the name of Gwendolyn Hall, the late Gwendolyn Hall, and then you have David Eltis and David Richardson. Those are the ones that pretty much came up with the Transatlantic Slave Trade database and defend the database. They critiqued Judith Carney's book called Black Rice because of the way, because they took issue with the origin story of where she was saying South Carolinian rice came from, which in the part of Africa she was saying it came from. And I think she was saying it came from a certain part of Sierra Leone. But David Eltis and David Richardson were arguing that couldn't be possible because the Transatlantic Slave Trade database doesn't show a significant number of Africans coming from those particular Sierra Leonean ports and landing in those particular parts of South Carolina. So then Gwendolyn Hall comes around as another historian. She states that you cannot look at the Transatlantic Slave Trade database and use that as the be-all, end-all to truth, because there are certain things that you need to consider. For one, the Transatlantic Slave Trade database does give you Africans that traveled from point A to point B, right? If they left Port Anamabo in the Gold Coast and they landed in Charleston, South Carolina, then that's what you know. That's all that tells you. However, what it doesn't take into consideration, the database does not take into consideration a few things. One thing it doesn't take into consideration is the slave trade in the hinterland. So, in Africa, away from the ports, there are trades going on from deep in the hinterland. So Africans who are being sold in particular ports in West Africa might not necessarily be from that region. They can come from way deep and beyond into somewhere else, right? That's one thing. Another thing that Gwendolyn Hall argued was that there is something called transshipments. So in other words, when slave ships landed in the Americas and dropped off these Africans, which are documented here in a database, there were local trades going on between islands, between countries, and things like that, which are not documented in the Transatlantic Slave Trade database. All right, so you have hinterland trade, transshipments, and the third thing is the clustering of Africans. What does that mean? Well, there are certain parts of West Africa, for instance, there are certain parts of the Americas, for instance, where certain West Africans were transported. Now, if you're looking at the database statistically, and you might see a place like Jamaica is overwhelmingly Igbo, right? But there might have been a certain slave master or a collection of slave masters in certain parts of Jamaica who decided, we don't want Igbo, we don't want Akan or Coromantee or Ashanti, which are the different names for that same group. We want Wolof. And this particular region of this particular region of Jamaica decided to import nothing but Wolof from the Senegambia region. Now, even though numerically the Wolof are not going to predominate or show any significant number in the Transatlantic Slave Trade database as being imported in large numbers, you're not going to see much Senegambia being transported into Jamaica. But for this particular region of Jamaica, where a collection of slave owners wanted nothing but Wolof, that Wolof culture will prevail over all other things, if they're numerically superior in that region of that country. The entire country may not account for that numerical superiority because they're mostly importing Akan or Igbo people from the Gold Coast and the Body Biafra. But just that region of Jamaica might predominate with Wolof culture. So clustering, that's called clustering. So there are certain clusters in certain parts of the Americas where you had preferences by certain peoples. So Gwendolyn Hall is saying that you cannot just use the database as the be-all, end-all to all truth. But what it can do, and I argue that it can give you an idea. You can't use it as an arguing tool to be like, you're wrong, if someone else has done extensive research deeper than just the database. But you could use it to guide you in the right direction. And I've used the Transatlantic Slave Trade database to guide me to come to, not to come to complete conclusions, but to come to presumptions. This is I probably have a lot of Igbo and Akan blood running through my veins, based on the database. All right, and plus use that information coupled with the family name, Kojo. It's safe to say that I'm Akan. So that's one of the ways I figured out my African ancestry without having to do the DNA. And I would say that the DNA is also problematic as well, because what that does, it only takes into consideration a very small fraction of your ancestors. Think about this: if you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, 16 great great grandparents, 32 great 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 grandparents, 64, 128, 256, 1012, and the list goes on. If you just go back 8 generations, you have thousands of ancestors, but they're only taking into consideration either the patrilineal line or the matrilineal line. And I think that is a little bit dishonest in terms of getting someone's DNA. Anyways, that's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Remember, the revolution will not be pesticides. Peace!
Land is the basis of all independence.